All right, so lecture number 2 is going to focus on homeostasis, and following on from the theme of the last lecture, this is another new term which you might not be too familiar with. So very simplistically, homeostasis is keeping the body in balance. It's ensuring your body temperature is within an acceptable range, that your blood glucose is stable, that your oxygen saturation remains high, that ions remain in the correct concentration in your blood, and that your blood pressure stays normal. From the minute we are born, and really even before that, our bodies are continually working to maintain homeostasis. When homeostasis cannot be maintained, disease, and in some extreme cases, death, will occur. So we have 5 learning objectives for this lecture, and they all revolve around homeostasis. So getting started, the first learning objective is to define homeostasis and explain its significance. Why is it important? So homeostasis is the body's ability to detect change, activate mechanisms that oppose that change, and thereby maintain relatively stable internal conditions. So homeostasis is said to be a dynamic state of equilibrium, meaning that it is constantly fluctuating. So as an example, your body temperature is not going to stay at a perfectly consistent 37 degrees Celsius at all times. You might do some exercise and it will rise, then you'll begin to sweat and it will come back down. You might stop exercising and the cool air hits your sweat, your body temperature drops even lower. Then you go and put on a jumper or jump in a hot shower and it goes back up again. And this is the same for basically all of the internal conditions homeostasis is responsible for. Why homeostasis is important is because despite being constantly challenged and disturbed, the body has a number of narrow ranges that it must stay within to be compatible for life or for us to survive. So if we take pH as an example, pH, or the hydrogen ion concentration within our blood, must stay within very narrow limits. When pH is too high or too low, it will denature proteins within the body and cause things like enzymes and ion channels to malfunction. Similarly, ion concentration within the blood needs to stay within relatively stable limits. So if you take calcium as an example, when calcium in the blood is too low, we'll actually start to break down our bones to increase our blood calcium concentration. And then when you have really low blood calcium, our muscle contraction will fail. So not so important for, say, our biceps, but really important for our heart, our cardiac muscle, our diaphragm, and our gastrointestinal system. With sodium, so the sodium concentration in our body helps regulate water concentration, and it helps us send an action potential, which is the electrical message that comes from the brain. So really important functions within the body. Now, within the human body, homeostasis is maintained via 2 of our bodily systems. So the nervous system, which communicates largely using electricity and is a fast-acting system that produces localized and short-lived changes. So very specific and fast-acting changes. The endocrine system works by secreting hormones or chemical messengers into the blood. And so to maintain homeostasis, these hormones produce relatively more widespread and lasting changes. Now, in the coming weeks, we will learn a lot more about the nervous system and how it works. And then many of you will go on to study systemic anatomy and physiology, which is where we'll cover the endocrine system. But for now, all I want you to know is that homeostasis is regulated by these 2 bodily systems. So now, how the body maintains or regulates homeostasis is through what we call a feedback loop or a feedback system. So the next learning objective is to describe the elements of a feedback loop. So if we imagine homeostasis as this seesaw, we want it to remain horizontal and stable, but it's going to fluctuate. It's going to go up, it's going to go down. The job of homeostasis is to bring it back to this horizontal, stable level. The first element of a feedback loop is a stimulus. So a stimulus is something that produces a change in a variable. This could be exercise, which increases core body temperature, or it could be eating your sandwich at lunch, which causes an increase in your blood glucose concentration. We then have a receptor, and a receptor detects the change caused by the stimulus. So in the case of exercising, a receptor would be the hypothalamus, which is a region of the brain which monitors core body temperature or the temperature of the blood. Or in the case of eating your sandwich, it's the beta cells within the pancreas that detect changes in the blood glucose concentration. So a receptor detects change caused by the stimulus. The next element of a feedback loop is the input that transmits information from the receptor along what we call an afferent pathway. And we will learn more about afferent and efferent pathways again when we talk about the nervous system. But it transmits information from the receptor to the control center. How I remember the term afferent pathway is the input A for arrives at the control center and A for afferent. So the information A for arrives along the A for afferent pathway along here. Our control center integrates information to determine appropriate response. So it takes information from the receptor, and it could be multiple receptors, transmits it to the control center, and it determines what that output should be. So what's an appropriate response for an effector to try and reduce the change in the stimulus? How I remember efferent, E for exiting, E for efferent. So the information exits the control center along the efferent pathway. This information will then travel to the effector, and the effector is what responds to the stimulus to reduce the effect of that stimulus. So in the case of exercising and increasing core body temperature, the effector might be your sweat glands. So you start sweating and it helps you cool down. Or it could be the blood vessels in your skin, which will dilate and rise to the surface of the skin so you can let off some heat. In the case of eating the sandwich for lunch, the effector could be your pancreas. The beta cells in your pancreas will release insulin, and insulin works on a number of different organs within the blood to bring your blood glucose concentration back down. So we have a stimulus that produces a change in a variable, a receptor that detects that change. The information from the receptor travels along an efferent pathway, this is the input, to the control center. The control center integrates that information and decides what to do about it. The output travels along the efferent pathway to the effector, and then the effector actually responds to reduce the impact of this stimulus. Now, another way you might see a feedback loop represented is through a diagram like this. And this has a bit more of a nervous system focus, and you will see lots of images like this when we do cover the nervous system. So here we have our receptor. Again, it's the hypothalamus in the brain, and it's detecting that this person is dehydrated. The receptor sends information along a sensory neuron, which is simply another term for the afferent pathway, because remember, A for afferent, A, it's arriving at the brain. In this case, the control center is the brain. You will also see it termed the integration center, obviously because it integrates that information. Could be the brain, it could be the spinal cord. The brain or spinal cord decides what to do with that information, and it sends the output along a motor neuron. So again, a motor neuron is another term for an efferent pathway, E for exiting the brain. In this case, our effector is the bicep muscles of this person. The muscles will contract. It brings this glass of water to the person's mouth. They drink, and they reduce those levels of dehydration. So what I want you to understand here is the general elements of a feedback loop, keeping in mind that each textbook or each resource that you use might describe or represent this loop in a slightly different way. They will all have the same general elements. So now that we have a general idea about feedback loops and all the elements of a feedback loop, we're going to have a bit more of a closer look at two different specific types of feedback. So learning objective number 3 is to describe a negative feedback and give an example. And so this is what I mean when I say homeostasis is a dynamic state of equilibrium. It is constantly fluctuating. It is not staying at a perfectly consistent set point. So if we take this figure as an example, if you have heating or cooling at home, you can set the room temperature to a certain temperature. In this case, the set point is 68 degrees Fahrenheit. So this is an American figure. So that's roughly, I think, about 20 degrees Celsius. However, the heater or the furnace in this case will not work to maintain exactly 68 degrees Fahrenheit at all times. That would be a very difficult and a very inefficient way to work. Instead, the furnace will work to keep the room at a temperature within a small range of temperatures. So within 2 degrees either side, a low of 66 and a high of 70. So what happens is that when the temperature in the room drops to 66 degrees Fahrenheit, the furnace will turn on. The furnace turning on will heat up the room. It will pass our set point of 68 degrees Fahrenheit and it will reach our upper limit of 70 degrees. At 70 degrees, that furnace will now turn off. The room will slowly cool, passing our set point of 68 degrees and again reach 68 degrees Fahrenheit. And so on, and so on, and so on. So we are constantly testing that temperature, and when it reaches either the upper or the lower limit, we are turning the furnace on or we are turning the furnace off. But it's all staying within that relatively narrow range of 66 degrees Fahrenheit to 70 degrees Fahrenheit. And so this is how the body works in terms of a negative feedback loop to maintain those internal conditions, to maintain homeostasis. So taking that example of heating and cooling, but looking at it from a human body perspective, we're going to walk through an example of a negative feedback loop, identifying each of the elements of that feedback loop. So we start with our stimulus. And again, I'll just use that example of exercising. So the person starts exercising. Our receptor are the thermoreceptors in the skin and in the hypothalamus in the brain. They detect that increase in body temperature from the beginning of exercise. This information about the increase in body temperature will travel along our afferent pathway. Remember, A for afferent, A for arriving at the control center. The control center for body temperature is the hypothalamus in the brain. This is another region of the brain that we'll talk about more when we come to the nervous system. The decision of the control center or the hypothalamus about what to do about the increase in body temperature will travel along our efferent, E for efferent, E for exiting pathway to our effector, which in this case is the sweat glands within our skin. The sweat glands will start to produce sweat and this will cool the body down. So now we're back at equilibrium. We're back at homeostasis. However, the person then stops exercising, but now they're sweating. The receptor, again, those thermoreceptors in the skin and in the hypothalamus in the brain detect the core body temperature is too low. This information travels along the afferent, A for afferent, A for arriving at the control center pathway. The control center is our hypothalamus. Again, that takes in all the information from the receptors and decides what to do about it. This information then travels along our E for efferent, E for exiting pathway to our effector. In this case, our effector is our skeletal muscle. This allows a person to start shivering. The shivering creates heat, and the person's body temperature will increase. And so this is just one example of a negative feedback loop within the body. Negative feedback loops are the most common type of feedback within the body, and it's what allows us to actually maintain homeostasis. So in your own time, what I would like you to do is to think of your own example. And when you think about that example, can you name the stimulus? Can you name the receptor? Where would the control center be? And what is the effector? And so I'm more than happy to have a bit of a chat through some of your examples, either in the online tutorial or in the lab class. But it would be really great if you would come up with your own example. If you're really struggling, I can give you some suggestions. Perhaps look at how blood glucose concentration or blood calcium levels are controlled within the body. You could look at the regulation of blood pressure or the production of red blood cells as just a few examples. So now that we've described a negative feedback system or a negative feedback loop, we're going to look at positive feedback. And unlike negative feedback, positive feedback tends to strengthen or reinforce a change in one of the body's tightly controlled internal conditions. So positive feedback is when the change detected by a receptor leads to a greater change in the same direction. So instead of reducing the impact of that change in a particular variable, it makes that change greater. And this is what we call a self-amplifying cycle. So the change causes greater change in the same direction. So a very generic example is, say you are on a farm, your ute backfires and it scares the cattle and they take off. There are cows running about and it creates panic. That panic scares other cows and now more cows are running. More cows running is causing more panic. The greater level of panic is causing even more cows to run. And so you can see how this is a self-amplifying cycle, and that change in one thing leads to greater change in that same direction. And this is how a stampede occurs. You have big numbers of large animals all running in the same direction because something frightened or excited one of them, which frightened the next one, which frightened the next one, and so on and so on. So coming back to an example from anatomy and physiology, childbirth is a really nice example of a positive feedback cycle where change leads to more change. So as the baby engages, so it moves down in the mother's stomach or the mother's uterus, the head of the baby pushes against the birthing person's cervix. Nerve impulses from the cervix are transmitted to the brain. The brain stimulates pituitary gland to secrete oxytocin. So oxytocin is a hormone that causes our contractions to become stronger. The labour contractions strengthen. The baby moves further down in the mother's uterus and now presses up harder against the cervix. The pressing up harder against the cervix causes more nerve impulses to be sent to the brain, which causes more oxytocin to be released, which causes stronger labour contractions, and so on, and so on, and so on. And this will occur until an external presence or an external condition causes this cycle to stop. So this will continue going on until there's no longer the head of the fetus pressing up against the cervix and that baby is birthed. So positive feedback does not directly maintain homeostasis, but there are certain situations within the body where positive feedback is required. So like negative feedback, I would like you to come up with your own example of a positive feedback cycle, although I do admit there are much, much fewer examples within the human body. And again, if you're stuck, two examples that I would suggest looking at is one, how our blood clots, and two, which very relevant at the moment, is how our immune system works. So when you have a virus or a pathogen enter the body and we create antibodies, how does that immune response actually work? And so we will go over these in our online tutorial, and of course you can ask any questions in your lab classes. And so the last learning objective is to describe the relationship between imbalance and disease. So we're going to start with this figure again, and I just wanted to point out that this horizontal line, when everything is balanced and in order, when the internal conditions of the human body are within those stable, narrow limits, that's when homeostasis is occurring. A homeostatic imbalance occurs when homeostasis cannot be maintained. So it causes this fluctuation. Most disease is caused by a disturbance of homeostatic mechanisms, and imbalances can occur for a number of reasons. So firstly, aging can cause a homeostatic imbalance. As we get older, the receptors within the body can become less sensitive, and then our ability to reverse those changes through our effectors can diminish. So as an example, when we get older, the receptors that detect how much water is in the blood become less sensitive. We therefore become less aware that we're dehydrated because we don't get that feeling of being thirsty. Because we're not drinking any water, the body must rely on other methods to conserve water, such as releasing hormones that helps us reabsorb more water in our kidneys. As we age, we release less of this hormone, and our kidneys aren't as efficient as reabsorbing that water into the blood. And therefore, dehydration can become very prevalent in an older population. Imbalances can also be caused by genetic mutations. So if you think of cancers and tumours, even tumours that aren't cancerous, and they cause our body to work less efficiently. So we're less able to complete those negative feedback loops and maintain that homeostasis. Pathogens, such as viruses, bacteria, fungi, can all alter how our body works and our ability to maintain homeostasis. So a virus, for example, will get into the cells of our body. They will change our DNA. They will replicate the DNA of the virus and therefore make our body less efficient and less able to maintain homeostasis. And then even environmental factors can cause homeostatic imbalances. So that could be something external, such as really extreme environmental temperatures, such as heat or cold. Maybe you go out to the snow, or you're going on a big hike in the desert. Or it can be internal factors, such as extreme stress. So when you're stressed, your body releases different stress hormones, things like cortisol and adrenaline. In an acute period, so for a short period of time, these are really useful. However, over prolonged durations, they can actually alter the way our body functions in a really inefficient way. So they can lead to things like homeostatic imbalances and disease. So one common example of a homeostatic imbalance is diabetes. So in a person whose pancreas is normally functioning, you eat something, perhaps you eat a cupcake, and your blood glucose concentration or your blood glucose level rises. The beta cells in the pancreas detect this change in blood glucose concentration and they release insulin into the blood. Insulin causes our liver to take up glucose and store it as glycogen. It's no longer needed in the blood, so we take it out of the blood, put it in our liver and store there to be used later. It also tells the cells in the body to take up and use this glucose in the blood. So again, taking glucose out of the blood, reducing our blood glucose concentration. What happens in someone with diabetes, and particularly in type 1 diabetes, is that the body's immune system will attack the beta cells in the pancreas so that they cannot release insulin. So we cannot, once our blood glucose level increases, we cannot bring it back down. And having high blood glucose concentration, particularly for a prolonged period of time, like with unmanaged type 1 diabetes, can have lasting effects on a number of different organs. So, again, we've come to the end of the lecture. Thank you for listening, and remember, if you have any questions, please don't hesitate to ask. What I would ask of you today is, once you've finished listening to the lecture, have a think about homeostasis. Why is it important? Have a think about those different elements of a feedback loop. Can you give an example of a negative and a positive feedback loop? And can you give me an example of a homeostatic imbalance caused when our body can't complete that negative feedback loop? Thank you very much, and I'll see you guys in labs and the online tutorial.